I am so much looking forward to today and of course to our first keynote this morning. I will introduce Alison, but only so briefly, because there's actually only three options. You either know her work already, you may have Googled her, or you will Google her afterwards. The only thing that is not allowed is to Google during her talk. And that's for a number of reasons, which I will be briefly explaining to you. I did this Googling, and what I found as a tagline, if you Google Alison's name, is photography and fungi. And this apparently, if I look at the denomination down the slide, is exactly what she's working on. So Alison Pouliot is an ecologist and an environmental photographer, and probably also. And if you like me work in literary studies, you know that fungi are all the rage at the moment, and it's thanks to people like Alison that quite literally fungi have been made visible in the academic landscape. So she's working both academically and artistically, and combines this in her work, and this is one of the many reasons I'm so much looking forward to her presentation today. The brief, things that one has to say in such a context is that Alison obtained her PhD from the Fenner School of Environment and Society at the Australian National University, and she's published a number of books since then: The Allure of Fungi, Wild Mushrooming, and most recently Underground Lovers, Encounters with Fungi. And there's two upcoming books, guess what, on fungi, Fungi Obscura and Mushroom Day. And it's very, very great that you're here. Thank you so much. Currently, Alison is, as you can see, a Volkswagen Foundation visiting professor at Rachel Carson Center in Munic. It's so wonderful that you've been able to come, and we are so much looking forward to your talk. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roman, for that lovely introduction. You have set the bar high, so thank you so much, and thank you all for coming along for your interest in this emerging and rapidly growing field, and of course thanks to the great team you've got behind the scenes that make everything run so seamlessly and smoothly. So, multi-species conviviality. It's a bit of a mouthful, really, isn't it? I'm not sure if it's such a good name for a band. What do you think, Owen? It's a bit of we need something more punchy, but it does feel good in the mouth. I mean, you can bite on it, have a feel of that in your mouth. You can swallow it, you can spit it out, you can taste it, you can roll it round and savour it and contemplate it a bit. But I confess, when I came across your fabulous paper, Birthday Boy, 2010, I thought, wow, this is an interesting idea, multi-species studies. And I thought, what does that mean? I was a little perplexed. I'm coming to multi-species conviviality as a zoologist, mostly working in ecology, but I was a little bit perplexed by the term because I thought that the multi-bit was superfluous. It seemed to me that as an ecologist that was a given that things are multi-species. It was something, what's the term of a pleonasm, I think the term is. And I thought, it's a bit like saying, I'm going to bake you a multi-ingredient cake. We know a cake is of many ingredients, that's what it is. I can have some eggs, but they're not a cake. But if I marry them with a couple of oranges and maybe a cup of sugar and, say, some almond meal, then this amazing thing emerges miraculously and deliciously called a cake. We know that's a cake. So I was stumped by it, but then I realised that reading lots of papers and coming to symposia, and indeed over the last days, that all these different perspectives and disciplines, these terms are so helpful, particularly if your discipline has focused on one species, namely Homo sapiens. So I can see the value in it, of course. Of course we know that, is there any such thing that's not multi-species? I mean, when I studied zoology back in the Pleistocene, they talked about, there was all these different life strategies that different organisms had, and then there was this alternative strategy called symbiosis. And of course, concepts in ecology have evolved very, very quickly, and we know now today what's not symbiotic. Often I try and think, is there an organism that anyone can tell me of that isn't symbiotic? I keep trying to think of it, but I can't think of anything that doesn't interact with something else. And indeed, yesterday we talked about how Homo sapiens are, of course, too. There's not that much human DNA in there. There's all kinds of other things, viruses, as we learnt last night, bacteria, fungi as well. I know many of us would have quite good populations of mites in our eyebrows. I went out with a guy once who had this thing that I called an ecosystem beard. The relationship lasted 2 days. And I didn't want to share with all these other species. So we are very multi-species. So I think it's wonderful to have all these perspectives from different disciplines. So today I'd like to talk about it from the perspective of an ecologist, but also bring in what's probably something like the other 99% of organisms that often get overlooked. Of course, if we're endowed with a backbone, with a spine, if we're vertebrates, they're the ones that tend to be the focus. Although yesterday we learnt about leafcutter ants, of course they're invertebrates as well, and their relationships with humans, although one of their most important relationships is actually with fungi as well. But there's all these other organisms too, particularly invertebrates, the spineless things, but also the fungi. So this is a whole other kingdom of organisms, and it's not that fungi are some favourite group of organisms. You know how some people are really into dragonflies or butterflies or poodles or kittens or something like that. I mean, don't get me wrong, some of my best friends are kittens, but it's not that mushrooms per se are this favourite group of organisms. It's what fungi do and are, and the processes and the foundations that they provide to then consider the rest of life. So that's something I'd like to explore today. We might just start, Christoph, with a 3-minute video just to introduce you. If you're not familiar with the fungi or with invertebrates, I've got this tiny 3-minute video I've put together of some of my companions and colleagues and kin. And please note, this is a very serious academic video. The forest floor is home to often unseen tiny lives. Many spineless creatures or invertebrates love to live in and feast on fungi. The trick, however, is finding them before someone else does and gobbles up more than they share. The lamellae of mushrooms are a favourite haunt of springtails that feast on fungus spores. Not everyone, however, is in such a hurry. Some are just getting out of bed. Others have more challenging logistics to resolve. As well as obstacles to negotiate. There's never an idle moment in the leaf litter, with everyone searching for their favourite fungus. Flies in particular need fungi as food, as places to do a spot of grooming, as nurseries for their young, and as dressing rooms to smarten up for a party. A party at the stinkhorns. Where there is no guest limit and all are welcome. Things were really kicking off. However, not everybody was happy about the noise of all that endless buzzing. Some couldn't even hear themselves think, let alone hear their mates. Then some would push it just a little bit too far. But forests, in their eternal wisdom, always find ways to restore the calm. I'll get you to put the presentation back for me, thank you. Lucy mentioned the great technique that we use in some of our research the other day, deep hanging about. And that's certainly one of my favourite techniques. The other one is rolling around in the dirt. And so they're the main two research techniques I've been using, but thank you. Anyway, so that's fungi and invertebrates. But what I'd like to do now, before we go into more detail, is just introduce you to some of the forms. And I'm sure we're all familiar with the umbrella-shaped cap and stalk style mushroom, but we also have all these other forms. I'm sure you've seen some of them, they're shaped like corals or jellies or lattice balls or puff balls or earth stars. So this is just a bit of an indication of these miraculous forms, shapes, colours. But remember, what we're looking at here is just the organs of the organism, so to speak. We're just looking at the reproductive structures. A bit like we can have a tree, which is composed of a trunk and branches and roots and flowers, but the flowers are the reproductive part. It's a bit like the equivalent in fungi, or a better analogy is probably with animals, given they're more closely related to animals. We've got the dog and then we've got the genitalia. So these are basically the sexual organs of the fungus, or the organs of the organism. The actual fungus itself, I'm sure many of you are aware, we've talked about mycelium. I love it. You know, 10 years ago you didn't hear this word just pop up in conversations, and we certainly are having something of a mushroom moment, a bit of a fungal awakening, as you mentioned, Roman. But this is the fungus organism, so to speak, and under certain conditions, often it's about a drop in temperature, an increase in soil moisture, they'll produce their mushrooms. And as I mentioned before, it's not that fungi or mushrooms are so much a favourite group of organisms, but the idea of fungi as a process of putting architecture in soils, of recycling, of doing this work. This is a bit that's exciting to me. You can see this next one here, very particular. It's just colonising this one leaf here. And of course, we find fungi in all kinds of environments, most commonly in forests. And whether it's a eucalypt dominant forest in Australia, we've got about 900 eucalypts, I think now, Kate, there's a lot. If we include Angophora and Corimbi, these other genera as well, we find all kinds of different fungi. Or whether it's in the mixed beech forests, broadleaf forests and conifer forests of Europe, or the amazing redwood forests of the Pacific Northwest of the USA, or perhaps the cloud forests of Portuguese Madeira. All of these different ecosystem types support myriad fungi. But we also find fungi in other environments that we don't expect, such as in deserts. And we particularly find what we know as hypergeous fungi, or fungi that produce their sporing bodies or their reproductive structures underground. I'm sure some of you are very familiar with truffle fungi. Perhaps some of you have eaten the Perigord, the famous Perigord truffles. And we also know, for example, this is the Central Desert in Australia, that various Central First Nations people, it was actually the women who'd walk through the desert and they'd push a stick into the sand and smell the end of the stick. And that's how they'd locate the truffles that they were eating, because truffles, some of you, I'm sure you're aware, have very particular scents and odours, because they're not relying on wind to release their spores. They need an animal to come along, dig them up, consume them, and bounce off and distribute their spores. But other sorts of deserts as well. Oh, that's interesting, Sarah. Such as,
there we are.
What's it going to be? What can we guess? What's it going to be? As glaciers. So this is the Aletsch Glacier in Switzerland. We're talking about what's often said to be the longest glacier in Europe, but we know every moment these glaciers are not only getting shorter, they're getting shallower as well. But as that glacier is receding and this bare landscape is exposed, the first things to colonise are often the fungi, particularly the lichens being among the fungi. So as I mentioned, some of the most familiar fungi are these umbrella-shaped forms. They're the ones we find on our pizzas, they're the ones we find in the supermarket, they're the ones we most commonly recognise as fungi. They come in all these different configurations, but typically they have these lovely lamellae or gills on the underside, all these different forms and configurations. And they develop for basically the one reason, to get their spores out there into the world. But there's other forms as well. Maybe this is not something you recognise as typically fungal. This is known as a cage fungus. It's in the stinkhorns. Or something like this, like a couple of antennae coming out of the log. Or perhaps some of you might know the chicken of the woods, because it's another one that we like to eat, but these amazing structures and forms. Or perhaps something like this, a little like a frozen waterfall. Or maybe you've seen earth stars. And all these fungi, they have these different forms, but they're essentially doing the same thing. They're recycling organic matter. So maybe you've heard the term, we talk about plants as producers, animals as consumers, but the fungi are the third part of that we often don't talk about. They're the great recyclers, breaking down those recalcitrant compounds in wood, like lignin and cellulose, unlocking the nutrients, releasing them for the plants. There's another group of fungi, like this little velvet court here, and it's called the velvet court because if you give it a cuddle, you'll notice it's got this beautiful texture just like velvet. These ones, or this one here, such as this little coral fungus, they're not recyclers or saprotrophs as they're known. These are what we call mycorrhizal fungi, and maybe you're already familiar with this term, but they're the ones that form relationships with plants. And if we look out the window, we can see all kinds of different woody species. We can see some trees, we can see some ivy, we can see grasses. The great majority of plants form relationships with fungi. And it's quite an abstract thing to imagine this relationship under the soil. And part of my work, not just as an ecologist, but I've spent the last 30 years also as an environmental photographer, predominantly trying to help people visualise environmental change. And when you've got something like a very event-based environmental change, say a wildfire or a flood or a hurricane or a volcano or an earthquake, there's a very sudden and radical change to the environment. Suddenly one day there's all this green stuff out there, all this buzzing and birds and sound and smells, fire comes through, the whole shape changes, it's blackened, it's radically different. It's easy to visualise, it's easy to photograph. But most environmental change isn't radical. It's slow, it's insidious, it's invisible. It's the stuff that Rachel Carson wrote about, more recently Rob Nixon. It's the slow violence, it's the things we don't see, the things that are hard to visualise, and oftentimes rather than photographing literally, I have to come across to more literary devices like metaphor to try and convey these things. But metaphors are also loaded with cultural assumptions. I mean, for example, if I said the word now, azaria, put up your hand if you know what animal species I'm going to mention next. Oh, come on. Kate does. So it shows how culturally loaded that is.
It's a dingo.
It's a dingo. So this is our cultural history. There was this terrible case in Australian history that some of you may or may not have heard of, but my point is simply that metaphors are tricky because if we don't have those same cultural assumptions, it's really hard to convey the message. One of the other things that's very hard to photograph is what's going on under the soil, in the dark of the subterranean, with the mycelium. And I think this is part of the reason why the fungi have been so overlooked for so long. We don't see what they're doing. Eben showed us the bats last night. They've been similarly overlooked, one because they're nocturnal, their sounds are out of our audible range. We actually have to bring the frequency down with a special machine to even hear them. We can't see them. And also they're so maligned historically. They're associated with all sorts of things we don't like. Those dreadful things called women, just like fungi, and all these other amazing negative histories. So that's why it's been interesting to focus a little bit on these organisms. And not only are they maligned, but what I like about fungi, as I said, it's not that they're a favourite group of organisms, so to speak. I had someone once, I was doing one of those dreadful breakfast shows on TV in Seattle, and the presenter said to me, "Oh, so tell me, why are you so interested in mushrooms?" And I think I gave the wrong answer. I said, "I'm not." And I think that wasn't what I was supposed to say, but the point was for me, what fungi do, not the reproductive structures, but what the mycelium does, is that they wobble the assumptions of everything I've ever learned about nature. I'm going to call it nature for a moment, or the living world, or living organisms. In that I grew up, both before uni but also at uni, learning about things like Darwinian ideas, or you might have heard of Carl Linnaeus, who gave us our naming system. We got these frameworks for how we were to understand nature. And they've been really useful in very many ways, but they typically looked at the biological autonomy of species, not the convivialities, not the interactions, not the relationships between them. They also gave us these frameworks, for example, let's say the notion of a bounded organism. Okay, I can look at Kate here and go, okay, she's got 2 arms, I can see 2 legs, she's got a head, that's handy, and I can pretty confidently say she's Homo sapiens. And I go, oh, there's a whole lot of you. I can see that you're a bounded organism. I can do things that scientists like to do. I can count you, and I can do some statistics, I can quantify you. But where do we start with the mycelium? I've lost that mycelium picture, but you saw it before. Where does it begin and end? How do we actually quantify? If we want to survey nature, I can go out and say, oh, there's 9 parrots sitting there on the branch. I can count them again. It's a bounded organism. There's 2 wings, there's some feathers, a head, there's a beak. I can see that's a whole organism, even though it is a multi-species collective within there. I can count them, they can quantify them. But if I see 12 beautiful mushrooms come up on my lawn in the morning, perhaps in a fairy ring, I can go, there's 12 mushrooms. But how many fungi are there?
Maybe just one.
Maybe just one. Maybe it's like we can see the 12 pears on the tree, but it's just one tree producing 12 pears. So it might just be one fungus mycelium producing this lovely ring of mushrooms, or maybe there's 740 different mycelia there, but only one could be bothered making any mushrooms. But my point is simply they're hard to quantify. And most of the ways we get fungi into, say, conservation or into protection or onto red lists, you know, red lists, these lists of things, species for protection, is we have to be able to quantify them. Very hard to quantify fungi. So that's one notion that completely got knocked out the window. Then I can go, okay, I can survey these birds. Now that one's got some pink plumage, so I know that's the female, and that one's a bit bigger and a bit more handsome, that's the male, so we've got this sexual dichotomy of male and female. Well, fungi don't just have 2 sexes, we actually call them mating types. Many have 2, some have 3, and there's one that's got 22,000. Where do we start? I mean, we came up with this notion, it's wonderful, LGBTI alphabet. Fungi were doing this back in the Devonian. I mean, they're a whole lot more imaginative than we are. So again, I sort of went, wow, so that's gone. We can't sort of go male and female. And then I thought, okay, so here in Germany, a woman can hope to live to 83.5 years. That's the average lifespan for a German woman. In Australia, you get a bonus 2 years. 85.5 years is the average lifespan in Australia. The German national tree, Quercus robur, the oak, can live to about 1,000 years. More commonly, there's sort of maybe around 500-600 years. A mayfly, this tiny insect, typically lives in its aerial phase for about a day. Most organisms, we can give them a lifespan. How old is a mycelium? How old does a fungus live for? Have a guess, be brave. Is it a year, a week? Oh, forever. So technically, theoretically, they don't have a lifespan. Like, hang on a minute, this was the stuff in my childhood. Remember The Hunger? Catherine Deneuve, Susan Sarandon, David Bowie, Eternal Life? Like, this was fantasy. How can something not have a lifespan? That mycelium's under the soil. It's not photosynthesizing, it's not a plant, it's its own kingdom. It's getting food like we do through digestion. We put the food into us, enzymes act on the food, we extract what we want, but fungi don't have a stomach, so they have to put themselves into their food and slobber. They release their enzymes directly into the surrounding environment and absorb their nutrition in external digestion. So long as there's food there, they can technically live forever. Isn't that a great idea? But again, these notions, wasn't something I learnt in science, that something could live forever. Except what happens is that we don't often let them do it. We come along and we build a road, and the fungus is under the soil, eating away, and it goes, oh, bitumen, yuck, can't eat that. And so it goes, oh, no more food. The road's, oh, there's no more food. What's it going to do? It panics. It goes, I'm going to die. I better make a mushroom, release my spores. And so we see eucalypts do that. Many trees do that in a drought. We see them flower in these bizarre times because it's a stress response. So as long as there's a source of food there, the fungus can live forever. But how much soil is there that's not disturbed in some way? We mine, we dig up soil, we break up that mycelial network, we kill the organism. We flood soils, we poison soils, soils dry out, we build roads, we seal the mycelium underground with concrete. So fungi probably rarely get to live for those very, very long periods of time. But coming back to this relationship bit, because this is what the conference is largely about, the convivialities, the connectivities, I've got my favourite high-tech metaphor that I'd like to use to try and explain how mycelium works in its relationship with trees. I'm just going to put the microphone down for a moment, but I'm hoping I can project loud enough for you to hear me. So let's just take an example of this. Can you hear okay at the back of this poster tube here? And imagine now we're all going to come down beneath the soil surface. Let's imagine we're all moving down beneath the soil. There's all kinds of squirmy things around us, but don't worry, we'll be back up soon. And there's tree roots under the soil. And let's imagine this poster tube is a magnified tree rootlet. A rootlet is a very small root on the end of a larger one, okay? Let's imagine it's a tree rootlet. It's under the soil, it's feeling around, it's trying to find water, it's trying to find nutrients. That's what I got taught in botany. That's what roots do. They give an anchoring device for a tree, because it can't just stand on the surface. And they're basically a conduit. They're a pipe to transmit nutrients, to transmit water back into the trunk of the tree. But what they didn't tell me is they're not very good at it. Plants aren't particularly good at getting the great suite of nutrients they need and enough water. And also, they're quite big, clumsy, clunky things, and they're under the soil. They're not fine enough to get into all those gaps and spaces, the interstitial spaces between the particles of sand and dirt in the soil. What they need to get those nutrients, to get that water, is their fungal partner, the fungus mycelium. And I demonstrate that with Kate's private pantyhose collection. So what we've got here, thanks Kate, I will get these back to you later today. Someone's volunteered to untangle them, so thank you for that. So what we've got, we're all under the soil, here's the tree root, and what the fungus does is it forms a sheath or a mantle around the tree root. What I'm going to do, if someone wouldn't mind hanging on to that, thank you very much. Thanks for that, Susanna. Thanks, yes. She washes them meticulously. Thank you, Ursula. Thanks, birthday boy. Thanks, Kate. And can I get some more trees over here? Thank you very much to hold on to that. So what we've got going, there's another one for you. You're a lucky tree. So what we've got here, again, just to reiterate, we've got the tree root under the soil, and we've got the fungus mycelium attaching to the tree root. We call this an ectomycorrhizal symbiosis. So to unpack that horrible big mouthful, ecto means external, the fungus is attaching externally, myco is the prefix for fungus, rhizal is root, symbiosis is an alliance. It's a mutually beneficial exchange between the plant and the tree root. What's happening is the fungus mycelium, you can see, is much, much finer. It's about 1/40 of the width of human hair, much finer than a tree root. So it's got much more reach than the tree root does, and get in all those little pores and gaps and spaces in the soil. We think that they can actually increase the absorbable surface area of the tree root by over 1,000 times. Think about a tree that can access so much more water because it's got its fungal partners compared to one that doesn't. Not only that, if the tree root comes across a bit of wood, it can't unlock the nutrients that are bound up in that wood. It needs the fungal partner that has enzymes that can break down those compounds, unlock the nutrients, and send them back to the tree. Now, when we practice agriculture, we typically, in industrialised agriculture, we strip all the fungi out of the soils, and then we put NPK, nitrates, phosphates, potassium on the soil. Most of it actually gets leached away, washed into rivers, but the plant absorbs some of it. NPK, that's like giving me peas, potatoes and carrots and saying you can eat those for the rest of your life. I'll probably live, but I'm not going to be very happy. I'm probably going to get sick, probably going to get tired, I'm going to be exceptionally grumpy, compared to if you give me a whole diet of different things, which is what the fungus does. It doesn't just bring back NPK, it brings back boron, manganese, selenium, a great range of different nutrients. So the plant, particularly if it's a crop plant, ends up with a much greater I guess, what would you call it, nutrient integrity than one that only has NPK. So our plants actually have much less nutrient density than when they grew, our crop plants, with fungi. So anyway, coming back to the forestry, we have ones called ectomycorrhizal and there's endo, which means they actually penetrate the cells, that's most crop plants, of the root of the fungus. So the fungus is expanding out the root system, finding nutrients, finding water, transporting them back to the plant, and in return, the plant gives the fungus a lovely feed of sugars that it produces through photosynthesis. So it's a I was going to say marriage, but they're not always mutually beneficial, are they? That's so cynical. That's so cynical. So mutually beneficial relationships going on here. And that's not all. Some fungi play a defence role as well. Some can secrete, they're nematicidal or nematode killing. These are these invisible worms that can cause damage to roots. And what they actually do, they loop their mycelium into a lasso. They release something delicious into the soil, or delicious if you're a nematode. The nematode comes along and goes, oh, that's nice, and swims through the loop, and then by hydrostatic pressure, the mycelium constricts, strangles the nematode, and absorbs its nutrients. So that's another way. Don't worry, we're all safe here under the soil, don't worry too much. So they do all sorts of amazing things, and this is where it becomes more astonishingly arcane. This tree doesn't just have one fungus, okay? So a eucalypt might have hundreds, if not thousands of different fungi connected to its root system. One tree, all doing different things. Some play a defence role, some play a protective role, actually secrete antibiotics. If I come along and accidentally put a spade through the root of the tree, it's like a first aid kit. So different fungi do different things. But also, let's say this tree is doing very well, but Lucy tree down in the gully there, she can't photosynthesise very well. So Lucy, she's on a bit of a rocky reef, she can't get enough nutrients, she's a bit too shaded. So this tree can send Lucy some carbon via the wood wide web. So some of you might have seen this notion popularised by the German forester Peter Wohlleben, and we know it's been very problematic. All metaphors are. That's what a metaphor does. It simplifies something, it takes away the nuance, it takes away the detail. And you probably also know about the 4,500 scientists who signed a petition against his book because there was some confusion about where the science and the fantasy actually met, and it wasn't defined. It wasn't that the science wasn't there. There was very good science that underpinned his work and his incredible experience, and it was the work of Suzanne Simard, a British Columbian mycologist, but sometimes it wasn't clear where we moved between the two. So there was a lot of controversy about it, but I still think this metaphor is powerful. And I've used this a lot in different workshops all around the world, often in the forest I'll use this metaphor. And we've got this, so imagine you're all trees connected up, and what Suzanne Simard showed is that what she calls a hub tree or a mother tree, an old tree in the forest, is on average connected to 43 other trees. And that when I learnt that was one of those life-defining moments, because I grew up, we have these strange groups in Australia called field naturalist clubs, and they're people who go out and look at nature, and often there's a specialist. So we'd go out in spring, we'd look at orchids, and we'd make inventories, lists of all the orchids. I think I started doing this when I was about 5 because my family wasn't into nature, so I went and did this with the clubs. Or we'd go down to the seaside and we'd look at all the intertidal organisms, and we'd make a list. And in autumn we'd go out and list all the fungi, or we'd go out and list all the birds. So I got all these big inventories of different species, which was valuable. But no one ever said every single orchid needs a fungus to germinate. Or that this numbat, do you know what a numbat is? Or a bettong, or a bilby? This bouncing animal that feeds on truffles, but the truffle's connected to a tree. We've got a 3-kingdom or queendom or theydom relationship here. We never talked about that. We always looked at this biological autonomy, these lone statues within the forest. And so one time I was on the border of France and Switzerland, working with the IUCN, the International Union for the Conservation of Nature, scientists there, and I was doing this metaphor in the forest, and everyone grabbed an end. We were talking about the trees connected by the mycelial network, and one of the scientists said, this has really changed the way I think about forests. You know, I think about this, whenever I step now, I realise that what happens to this tree could have implications to Lucy tree or something else. And she said, my sister, she's just over the border in Besançon in France, and she runs a crèche. can you come along and explain ectomycorrhizal symbiosis to the kids at the creche? And I went, creche? Like little people. I'm not very experienced at working with little people. I said, what, how old are they? She said, oh, 3 or 4. I said, ectomycorrhizal symbiosis. Do you think that's not a little too complex? Could we maybe wait 10 years? You know, I said, do you think I'll get this? She said, these are French children. I went, oh, okay. I said, oh no, how am I going to do this? She said, come on, just bring your pipe and pantyhose, you'll be right. And I said, oh dear, this is going to be traumatising, but I'll give it a go. And so I got these really great ones, like psychedelic colours and sparkles and fishnets. And so we get to the forest, beautiful turning oak forest, light was coming through. These kids are tearing around being kids, and they're all grabbing an end of the stocking. And as I said, I'm not very experienced working with little people. They're the most important people in the world to work with, but I'm not very good at it. And this is where I made fatal flaw number 1. I had 18 ends of the stocking and 19 children. So everybody grabbed an end, and they're all pulling on it madly and putting the tension on, being little kids. And this one little girl, she kept trying to get an end, and she missed out. Well, it was a catastrophe. She has a total meltdown, starts screaming, spinning around on her fly, like a dying fly on her back, and screams French expletives at me. And I thought, oh, what do I do? And then I thought, I took off my hard hat and I put it on her head and I said, you've got the most important job of all. You're the forester, and you've got to decide which of these trees you're going to cut down. That was fatal flaw number 2. It took her about a millisecond. She flies horizontally through the sky, and she grabs this little guy around the throat and pushes him into the mud. And because the kids have so much tension on the network, because he went flying, they all went flying, the whole network collapses, and they understood the concept like that. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying when we cut one tree down in the forest that all the trees fall down, because they all got back up and started punching each other. See, it's not as convivial as you thought. So it was simply, but what for me was interesting, there's tiny people, they weren't making lists and inventories and thinking of biological autonomy, they were thinking of networks. Maybe they weren't quite yet thinking of consequences, maybe that came later, but they were thinking of processes, networks, interrelations, that what we do here could have implications there or over there, or maybe a kilometre that way, because fungi can be vast. And it's a very different way about thinking about systems, whether we're talking about a forest, whether we're talking about a wetland, an estuary, your back garden, a lawn or whatever. It's a very different way when we recognise not the biological autonomy that I grew up with the Linnaean ideas and the Darwinian ideas, but these interactive convivial networks of organisms. Thank you, mycelium holders. So I hope that metaphor makes a bit of sense. You can all come up above ground again now. So just going a little further, I just wanted to talk about, I've talked about some of these wonderful forests, and you saw these beautiful pictures of relatively, not untouched, but fairly healthy looking forests. But we've got a lot of landscapes looking like this. So this is a drought in Australia. You can see there's nothing green. There's no grass. Highly compressed soils because hard hoops don't go well in Australian landscapes. What role do fungi play in landscapes like this, or landscapes like this? So again, looking at environments now where we're producing food, human interactions, we've got one lonely tree there. It's going to have a hard time sharing its resources with other trees. Or landscapes like this that have been highly damaged by fire. And yet, sometimes the first things to come back will be the fungi. I've worked in a lot of landscapes where we've had absolutely devastating fires where metal poles on the street have actually melted. And yet I've come in and seen this almost high-vis, psychedelic, I could use the microphone, couldn't I, shimmering above the soil. And then I look closely and it's actually a fungal integument or covering. Trying to put that, when I say trying, it's not doing it quite so deliberately, but putting that stability back into the surface so it doesn't blow away again. Fungi are often the foundation that come up before those first seeds germinate after a catastrophe. So they'll put that stability in, because when we have a fire, we lose the canopy, the water then directly hits the ground, it doesn't gently trickle down the tree, and the soil gets dislodged and washes away, the fungi or the biological crusts are often the first things that come back. And then if a bird flies over and excretes a seed and it lands among the fungi, it's actually got a bit of shelter, it's got a nutrient supply, it's got a much better chance of actually germinating and having a good life. Also after forestry, how do we get fungi back? Or after drowning landscapes, such as in this lake scene, Outer Lake in Washington. But I've been working a bit lately looking at fungi in these ruderal or interface environments. I used this term yesterday, in towns, in places where people live. And here, I don't know whether you can recognise, we've got the darker green, this is a plant, this is a moss, and this is lichen, often again the first colonisers. And they make a beautiful tapestry, don't you think? Other places too, lichens can pretty much grow on any substrate, not just on rock or wood. On this car that I found in the forest, they were growing on the paint, they were growing on the metal where the paint had disappeared, they were growing on the upholstery inside the car, they were growing on the rubber of the tyres, they were growing on the plastic of the windshield wiper cover. They can pretty much grow on any substrate, and they're basically living just from whatever they can absorb in the passing mist, hence why they're very, very slow growing. Here's a speedboat in France. You can see it's also become a palette, a tapestry, a surface for fungi to grow on. And this is a fungus growing in my bike shed. So you'll find them. If you look, you'll see them all among us as well. And here's a shoe being turned back into nature again by some mosses and lichens. But I just want to show you a quick map of Australia. This was provided by not a fungus, but by something called a slime mould. And you can see this is Tasmania, the southern island. There's been a little bit of climate change. You've got a bit of inundation because the southern state of Victoria has already disappeared. But most of it's actually desert. We do have some frightening charismatic megafauna there. You can see that giant thing there in the middle. But most of the fungi are in the coastal regions where we have forests, but there are desert fungi as well. But here's a map of Europe provided by what's called the map lichen, Rhizocarpum geographicum. I can't keep track of Europe because the boundaries keep changing. We keep redrawing them. But I want to show you another map of Australia. Perhaps some of you have seen this already. And what this is showing is the different First Nations language groups all around the country. Just phenomenal. And I've had the huge privilege of working with about 15 or 16 different First Nations groups over the last few decades. And a lot of my work today is not doing research, but again, operating at that interface of academia and the general public. And whether it's conservation groups or rangers or park managers, First Nations people, photographers, filmmakers, I love to be able to get out and try and translate some of this information and to share knowledge. Most of our First Nations knowledge in Australia has been lost as people have taken off country. They lost the language, they lost the dances where they expressed that knowledge, and so most of the groups I worked with, they say that has gone. The Yolngu people in the far north of Australia, that's very different. They're probably the only group that weren't moved off country. There was 3 European attempts to settle northern Australia, they all failed, and so the people there have been continuously on country. But this is one of the few fungi known as a white punk. That's a better name for a bad. That we know Aboriginal people used to carry fire. It was also used by the Māori people of New Zealand a lot of them contain antibiotic compounds. They use them to dress wounds. So we do know a little bit of the ethnomycology of fungi. This is one of the native Australian truffle fungi. Many of them are edible. And we know of about a dozen species that were eaten by First Nations people. And this one I put in because we're starting to decolonise the language as well. This one's known as Mycena nagan. And I'm not sure if you know what a nagan is, but it's an Aboriginal spirit. And the person who named this said the white dots were like the sparkling eyes of the spirit ancestors. So it's nice to see some of the First Nations language coming in. So I work as much as I can with different people, and a lot of it's about being in situ in the forest, making it a very sensorial experience. And I'll just whip through these. This is when I was with Ursula in Norway last year with a group of PhD students out in the forest. These are the 93-year-old hands of Elsie Howard. She's a spud farmer or a potato farmer, but those hands, her hands know fungi very well. She's foraged her entire life. This is Guy Grossi from Florentino's restaurant in Melbourne. He's an Italian chef there, again working with fungi, whether it's as food or in other ways. So I'll just snip through some of these pretty quickly. photography, working with people again, trying to visualise fungi. And I've learned so much from working with artists. I remember coming up to this woman once in Switzerland. She was lying on the ground at a photography workshop, and I watched her for a while. It was raining. She was quite a bit older, and I thought, wow, she's so nimble, and she's lying there, and I was dying to see what she was photographing. And I came up to her, and there was a stump, and there was these 3 perfect green mushrooms on these aqua mushrooms, and I went, oh, wow, that's Stropharia aeruginosa. Bloody scientist, I tell you. And you know what she did? I said, that's a verdigris agaric. She very gently and very kindly just sort of rolled her head around, and she looked at me. And you know what she said? It could be called Fred Astaire, for all I care. And I got her point. You know, why do we have to name everything? For some people, you know, it imbues something with significance having a name, but not everyone wants that. She was marvelling. She was an artist. She was looking at the colours and the forms and the shapes. The name didn't matter. And I remember a similar thing. I was out with a colleague on this amazing wetland at dawn, and there's this incredible dawn chorus of different birds, and I was completely lost in the musicality of this amazing sound. And he's here going, that's a spotted puddleoat, that's a tree keeper, I'm like, oh, it was the music in that moment, not the science. So we all have our different ways we approach nature. So these are just a few images. Again, this is the same metaphor you just saw, working in the forest and trying to release the fear. In the English-speaking world, we're often quite frightened to touch fungi or to get too close to them. So we often begin by sensitizing our fingers to this great diversity of different textures and whoops. Just we're nearly there. Thank you, Christoph. So, and sometimes too, collecting fungi, if you forget your basket, think of your glasses case. And you can see these smiling faces of the people out there in the field. And you know, all mycology now, the study of fungi, and almost all of the surveying of nature is molecular. We rarely look at whole organisms. If I want to know what fungi are out here, you know, I can go out and look at them because I love these forms and things. But today, mostly we take a teaspoon of soil, extract the DNA. And I was at a conference at Kew a couple of years ago. There was 300 delegates, which is amazing for a conference on fungi. Usually there's 3, not 300, and a dog and your mum and your aunt, and that's it. Of the 100 presentations, 100% were all molecular. Everyone was only looking at DNA. No one was going to the forest anymore. It was all, so to me this is very abstract. And I ask you, who's fallen in love with the DNA sequence? You know, we talk about care a lot when we're talking about multispecies conviviality, but we can't tell someone to care. But maybe you can help create the experience where they fall in love, or where they're moved, or where they're touched in some way. Anyway, one of the things I've also been trying to do is rally government a bit. And again, you know, I look at our coat of arms in Australia. Look at this, charismatic megafauna, big bouncy thing and a great big bird. So I've just redesigned it. What do you think? Actually, is that a crime to do something like to defile your... Oh, are we being recorded? I think I've just gone to jail. Anyway, I'll end it there, but thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me.